Tonight we stumble into a forgotten corner of Victorian history, one lined not with gold, or glory, or even good hygiene, but with lint. You walk into a drawing room smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and lemon polish, the kind where every shelf groans under the weight of delicate jars. Inside each one, fluff, bits of fuzz, pocket refuse, grayish blue, sometimes pinkish. This is not trash, you're told. This is science. Your fingers brush the edge of a glass jar. Inside, the lint swirls slightly, as if remembering its purpose. And then the butler clears his throat. Yes, the Victorian era had butlers for everything, even your spontaneous lint discoveries, and suddenly, you're being ushered into a story you absolutely did not see coming. You probably won't survive this, narratively speaking, because it'll ruin how you look at your dryer ever again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location and the local time in the comments below. Now, dim the light, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through a foggy London alley, glancing up at chimneys spewing smoke like the city's exhaling too hard. The year is 1874. You're holding a map to somewhere called the Lint repository. Of course, no one talks about it openly. You had to bribe a librarian with a handful of copper coins and a promise not to mock his tweed collection. You duck into a townhouse. Gas lamps flicker. There's a brass plaque over the fireplace, engraved with the words, "To see the invisible, Lintus et Scientia." You're greeted by a man whose mustache could house a family of birds, and he gestures silently toward a shelf of sealed jars, all labeled by date, color, and origin. Coat pocket. June 7th. Mail. Derbyshire. You're not sure if it's an art piece or an illness. The Victorian era, you quickly learn, isn't just steam trains and corsets, it's a full-blown frenzy of classification. Rocks. Flowers. People. Emotions. If it exists, someone in a waistcoat is writing it down and shoving it into a cabinet. And so begins your tumble into the weirdest scientific obsession you've never heard of, the collection and study of lint. Lint, in this context, isn't just fluff. It's considered a living archive. Every fiber, a story. Every dust mote, a clue. It contains particles of dead skin, delightful, hair, less delightful, fabric threads, soot, pollen, and maybe even a touch of your soul. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine scientific effort or an elaborate excuse for certain Victorians to never clean under their beds. You step closer to the jars. Each one has been sealed with wax and catalogued by an obsessive hand. Drawing room sofa. The 12th of July, 1873. Contains traces of elderberry jam. You weren't expecting to feel something, but you do. It's weirdly intimate. Like looking into someone's laundry, but historically justified. One of the scientists, a man who insists on being called Dr. Greywhistle even though no record of a degree exists, leans in and says, "Did you know lint reacts to the anxieties of its host environment?" You smile politely, but he's not kidding. He's holding a magnifying glass over a puff of lint as if it might whisper secrets. "This came from a widow's shawl," he says gravely. Post-bereavement. Notice the extra density. The truth is, the Victorians believed lint could be a silent witness. Much like phrenology thought bumps on your head could reveal your personality, remember that nonsense. Lint promised insights into domesticity, social class, and health. For them, a little fluff in a jar wasn't trivial, it was a domestic footprint. Even Charles Darwin, whose beard likely spawned its own lint colony, made remarks on the accumulation of dust in natural environments. One of his letters jokingly referenced a naturalist's dandruff. Most scholars think he meant lichen. But we'll pretend it was lint for our purposes. Meanwhile, fringe circles took the obsession further. In 1869, a now-lost pamphlet titled On the Liminal Significance of Lint argued that each person's lint was a unique identifier, what modern folks might call DNA light. The writer, Reverend Percival Thimberley, claimed he could read character from it. Your fluff said you were melancholic, or prone to dishonesty, or, in one case, harboring unwholesome urges toward upholstery. At this point, you realize, this isn't a science to these people, it's a philosophy. A woolly, absurd, deeply earnest philosophy. And like all philosophies, it requires tools. Dr. Grey Whistle shows you his lint fork, a tiny, three-pronged silver utensil used to extract lint without disturbing its structure. He's very proud of it. It minimizes fiber trauma, he says solemnly. He also hands you a notebook filled with handwritten lint codes. If it twitches under the scope, it gets a red asterisk. You want to laugh, but then you remember people once believed radium made your water healthier. And Victorians absolutely brushed their teeth with crushed charcoal and used leeches for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Suddenly, collecting lint doesn't seem so weird. The room feels warmer now. Maybe it's the gaslights. Maybe it's the feeling that, against all logic, you're starting to respect this fluffy weirdness. You scan the shelf again. Some jars hold coarse brown tufts, others are blue haze so light it might vanish if you blink. There's even a jar marked Royal Coattail, Windsor, 1871. You don't ask questions. There's one last jar that catches your eye. It's labeled simply, Mother's Chair. Inside, pale pink fuzz, one silver hair, and a single button. You don't need to be a scientist to know that's more than a sample. That's a memory sealed in glass. Outside, the fog creeps up again, and somewhere, a horse clops by pulling a cart full of coal. But here, in this echoing room, you're beginning to realize that lint, the humblest of human detritus, might just be the most intimate archive of all. You turn from the jar marked Mother's Chair and realize the room is much larger than it first seemed. Dim light pools in corners where velvet curtains drape low, and deeper into the house you hear a grandfather clock coughing out the hour. There's a smell of wax and old wool, what you now recognize as the scent of archived lint, and a low hum from the walls, like the place itself is trying to tell you something. But to truly understand why lint had a moment in the Victorian sun, you need to step back, way back, to the broader obsession of the time, classifying everything. The Victorians didn't do chill. When they went in on something, they really went in. Bugs. Let's draw every single species, pin their little corpses in frames, and fight about Latin names. Plants. Start a herbarium the size of a small cathedral. Human skulls. Let's not even talk about how many pseudoscientists tried to prove their social theories with calipers and a ruler. You're now in a different room, and someone has placed a thick, leather-bound volume into your hands. The gold-lettered spine reads, A Taxonomy of Domestic Debris. Inside, drawings of lint under a microscope, lovingly shaded in graphite. One entry reads, Sample 23, bedroom floor. Composition, cotton thread, skin flake, oat porridge trace. Emotion, mild disappointment. You're not sure whether to laugh or applaud. This obsession with labeling, the need to force the world into tidy boxes, wasn't just a quirk. It was a response to the rapid chaos of modern life. The Industrial Revolution had upended every norm. Cities swelled with workers, trains blurred distances, and the natural world was being paved over with soot. So, in the face of all that change, Victorians clung to order like a lifeline. Enter lint. Small, overlooked, but everywhere. It was the perfect frontier for those desperate to maintain control. It floated innocently into coats, lodged behind furniture, gathered in corners like it was staging a slow coup. And importantly, it resisted categorization just enough to be interesting. Not quite dust, not quite textile, lint lived in between. Like a cryptid with a PhD in domesticity. Historians still argue whether this desire to classify lint was driven more by curiosity or by anxiety. Were they genuinely fascinated by the makeup of household fluff, or simply terrified of what they couldn't control? Either way, you're now holding a page that compares lint from 7 different top hats. One entry is particularly vivid: top hat, merchant class, moderate use. Dark wool fibers, hints of cigar ash, faint perfume of bergamot. Speaks of late nights and commercial regret. Who writes this stuff? You turn the page and find a chart titled Lint Stratification by Social Class. At the top, aristocratic lint, described as fine, sparse, perfumed. At the bottom, servant lint, dense, practical, sometimes with soot or hay. The implication is clear. Even your fluff betrayed your station. It's here you meet Miss Cressida Elmbridge, Victorian lady scientist and relentless advocate for lint equality. She argued that class-based fluff theories were absurd and biased, that all humans, regardless of social standing, shed lint at roughly the same rate. Her 1871 paper, on the democratic nature of pocket debris, got her laughed out of 3 science salons but earned her cult status in a radical hygiene pamphlet group. You're shown her personal jar collection. One entry reads, "Stable boy's cuff, unremarkable lint, though braver than most." There's humor in this, sure, but also something oddly respectful. These people, for all their tweed-clad absurdity, were trying to make sense of themselves. Lint became a mirror, a way to peer into the creases of the human condition without getting caught snooping. One eccentric theory, long since discredited, suggested that lint patterns followed the lunar cycle. A Mr. Tobias Quell, part-time astronomer and full-time lint mystic, insisted that full moons caused fluff accumulation to double, especially in unmarried men. His diagrams connect Jupiter, beard trimmings, and sock lint in a constellation-like web that looks like a toddler got hold of a compass and a crayon. You laugh, but then you notice a modern echo in your own life. Ever cleaned the lint trap on your dryer and wondered why it's always full, even after just one pair of pants? Ever picked lint off your sweater in a meeting and realized you have no idea where it came from? Lint haunts us. And the Victorians, well, they just got there first. A side note, not all lint was created equal. Victorian scientists developed entire hierarchies based on source. Clothing lint was highly valued, especially if it came from undergarments. Calm down, nothing weird, just proximity to skin. Upholstery lint ranked lower, too impersonal, too processed. The lowest tier, what they called travelers' fluff, accidental accumulations from public spaces. It was considered socially contagious. Basically, your sofa might give you someone else's lint cooties. This leads you into the lint isolation chamber. It's a closet, really, but lined with brass and velvet, and used to extract personal lint samples without outside contamination. You step inside, and an old man with surgical gloves gently swipes your lapels with a silver brush. It's oddly intimate. He then holds up the fuzz and whispers, "Ah, big thoughts. Restless mornings. Possibly toast crumbs. Okay, you're impressed. You're also beginning to realize something deeper. In a world exploding with new technology, telegraphs, railways, factories, the Victorians weren't just studying lint. They were studying themselves. Lint became their accidental diary, their confession, their weird little secrets spilled across the upholstery. And now you're part of it. The clock chimes again. A cat you hadn't noticed until now hops onto a desk and immediately sheds enough fur to qualify as a research subject. You reach down, pick up a bit of fuzz from the floor, and drop it into an empty jar. Congratulations. You're a Victorian scientist now. You're seated now in a parlor that feels like it's been embroidered into existence, lace curtains, tufted furniture, embroidered everything. There's a teacup in your hand you don't remember accepting, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Bellington is explaining, without a hint of irony, that lint, quite literally, built the foundation of what Victorians called domestic science. Yes, domestic science. You might call it home economics. But in the 1800s, it was pitched as cutting-edge research. Not just how to boil an egg without insult, but how to diagnose a household's moral and physical condition based on the detritus it left behind. You take another sip of tea, but she's already up and rummaging through a drawer. She hands you a linen-bound booklet, Lint, Dust, and the Moral Home. Published 1856. You flip through. Diagrams. Tables. One dramatic chapter titled The Fluff of Fallen Women. Victorian subtlety, everybody. The logic went like this: your home reflected your soul. If your curtains were clean, your heart was pure. If your bed was dusty, your character was questionable. And if your lint trap overflowed, well, the less said, the better. Historians still argue whether this was a sincere scientific endeavor or a backdoor method for controlling women through cleaning advice. Either way, domestic science became a strange hybrid of chemistry, moral policing, and housewifely anxiety. You follow Mrs. Bellington down a short hallway, slippers soft on patterned carpet, into what she calls the observation nook. It's a sort of domestic laboratory, delicate tools lined up like surgical instruments, a glass display of different broom straw types, and a collection of sealed jars labeled not by date, but by emotion. You lean in. Bitterness. Hope. Post-dinner regret. Turns out, there were those in Victorian society who believed lint, especially dust from bedsheets or coat linings, absorbed human emotion. Some thought it could store dreams. Others claimed it carried stress, like static charge. One fringe theorist named Dr. Godfrey Spratt even argued that lint could be reactivated, sprinkled in warm water and stirred gently to re-release a person's lingering thoughts. You pause and glance at your teacup. But what surprises you most isn't the theory, it's how seriously everyone seems to take it. These aren't charlatans in goggles, though yes, there are a few monocles. These are respected figures in early science, household reformers, physicians, ministers. Lint, somehow, has slid from nuisance to evidence. A minor household plague turned scientific gold. In 1862, a group of reform-minded thinkers formed the Society for Domestic Integrity and Lint Studies, STILLS for short. Yes, that acronym was always pronounced SIDLS, and no one questioned it. They published a quarterly journal, held conferences in Brighton, and famously declared, "The well-fluffed home is the well-formed soul." You hear muffled laughter from somewhere in the house, and realize a group of young women is gathered around a square of dark velvet on the floor, carefully dusting lint from various types of fabric: wool, muslin, silk. They're taking notes. You sit among them. One hands you a magnifying lens and points to a pale fiber. "Wool," she says. "But see the orange speck? It's turmeric. Kitchen adjacent. Possibly apron lint." She beams like she's solved a crime. Which, oddly enough, she kind of has. Because for these women, often barred from formal science, domestic science offered a rare intellectual outlet. They became observers, recorders, pattern seekers. And lint, ever present and undignified, gave them a secret territory to claim. In this way, the humble dust bunny became subversive. There's a story you overhear, about a governess named Clara Welk, who famously mapped the seasonal changes in her master's household by tracking the color variation in weekly lint samples. Blue in winter, heavy coats; beige in spring, linen sheets; gray in autumn, chimney soot mixed with sock lint. She reportedly predicted a mistress's affair by noting the sudden appearance of long red threads in the master's coat pockets. No one believed her, until the mistress eloped with a red-headed fencing instructor. Yes, really. Clara's method was dubbed threadline analysis, and while dismissed as anecdotal, It lingered in the margins of Victorian domestic journals. A few even toyed with the idea of teaching it to maids as a discreet way to monitor employer stability. Lint surveillance. Eat your heart out, smart homes. And if you're wondering whether this passion ever got weird, oh yes. There's an entire drawer dedicated to lint art. Some of it is charming, delicate portraits made from teased fibers, mounted like miniature embroidery. Some is questionable. One piece appears to be a full recreation of Hamlet's skull scene in lint form. You squint. That's definitely a bit of cornflake in Ophelia's hair. Yet somehow, none of this feels mocking. There's sincerity in it. Reverence, even. In a world where women were told their place was in the home, they took that place and turned it into a research station. A lab. A confessional booth. And lint, sticky, stubborn, unglamorous, became their co-conspirator. You glance around. Everything is quiet now. A soft breeze moves the lace curtain. The lamp flickers slightly, and the jar nearest you catches the light just right, showing off a shimmer of gold thread caught among the grey. Something from a ball gown, perhaps. Or a stage costume. Maybe it danced once. And you think, how strange and beautiful it is that people once believed this mattered. That inside these tiny, unwanted fibers could be found a map of the human soul, drawn softly in dust. You're led now to a back room where the wallpaper peels like old paint and the air carries that peculiar scent of paraffin and pipe smoke. The lighting is dimmer here, the furniture heavier, and every surface seems to sag under the weight of strange jars and weirder intentions. A brass sign on the door reads, in delicate cursive, "The Lint Hunters Society." You enter quietly. There's a long table at the center, surrounded by men of various shapes, mostly mustachioed, many sporting pince-nez or cravats, all with the peculiar twitch of people who haven't blinked enough today. One is arranging tweezers by size. Another is polishing a magnifying lens with a small linen cloth labeled specimen only, do not use for faces. And then the arguments begin. No, 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 bellows a man in a tweed waistcoat that probably hasn't been washed since the Crimean War. If it came from inside the glove, it's not technically pocket lint. It's glove fluff. Different origin point. Another man snorts into his tea. So you're just going to ignore cross-contamination from the wrist lining? Preposterous. You are seated between two gentlemen who immediately begin pulling folded handkerchiefs from their coats and placing small piles of lint onto black velvet squares. The ritual is almost reverent. One of them nods to you and says, "Observe the clumping pattern," indicative of a sedentary lifestyle and possible unrequited affection. This is the Lint Hunters Society in full swing. Founded in 1868 by Lord Roderick Smythe Bramley, a nobleman with a passion for fluff and an unfortunate allergy to wool, the Society's mission was, in his words, to preserve, interpret, and elevate the humble lint to its rightful place in the annals of scientific exploration. Their logo? A sheep on a pedestal. Membership was invitation only, and meetings took place in discreet parlors, hunting lodges, and once aboard a stationary zeppelin. You know, for atmospheric integrity. Historians still argue whether the society was primarily scientific or mostly a social club for men with too much leisure and a fondness for highly specific arguments. One early review in the Gentleman's Observer referred to the society as more theatre than theory, though it quickly added that their lectures were unexpectedly moving. And they were thorough. Every piece of lint collected was logged in what they called the Fluff Ledger, a massive tome containing columns for color, density, suspected origin, and emotional resonance. Yes, emotional resonance. One page reads, the 3rd of May, 1870, pale grey, likely from lower coat lining. Smelled faintly of sandalwood. Felt lonely. You can't help but notice how seriously they take themselves. One member, Captain Winthrop Chuzzleton, tells you in a whisper that he once spent 6 weeks in the Scottish Highlands cataloguing sock lint under extreme moisture conditions. Nearly lost a toe, he adds, proudly. But oh, the samples. You've never seen such plum-colored fibers. A bell rings at the front of the room. The meeting is called to order. Tonight's debate: whether lint found on a public bench can be ethically classified as owned. You sit back and watch the madness unfold. Arguments rage. Charts are produced. One man dramatically unveils a jar of lint collected from the upholstery of a third-class railway carriage and insists it proves that the working class experienced fluffier sorrow. Another presents his rebuttal in verse. It's ridiculous. It's poetic. It's oddly persuasive. But then comes the ritual. At every meeting, one member is chosen to share their fluff of the month, a particularly rare, beautiful, or meaningful piece of lint. Tonight, that honor falls to Dr. Basil Pennethorne, who walks slowly to the center of the room holding a small, ornate box. He opens it. Inside, a tiny wisp of deep green and purple fibers, shimmering faintly under the gaslight. Acquired, he says with quiet gravity, from the inside lining of a Russian ballerina's shawl. Post-performance. Pre-absinthe. Gasps ripple through the room. One man begins to cry softly. And here's the thing, somehow, you get it. Because even in your own time, you've probably held on to tiny, stupid souvenirs, a movie ticket stub, a dried flower, a button that fell off during a first date. These guys, they just turned it into a ritual, a performance, a science. You're handed a notebook and asked to jot down a reflection on the emotional weight of a lint sample currently being passed around, a soft, cinnamon-colored fluff ball that smells vaguely of firewood and peppermint. You write, reminds me of winter. Warmth under the coat. Something old. Something gone. No one mocks it. Someone even nods. There's a certain stillness in the room now, broken only by the ticking of a large wall clock and the quiet rustle of tweed as men lean forward to examine the next sample. You're beginning to understand that this wasn't just about lint, it was about presence. Attention. Finding meaning in what most people overlooked. And while yes, some members were clearly more invested in the drama than the data, there's definitely a guy in the corner wearing a monocle for flair, not vision. You sense a genuine devotion here. To memory. To smallness. To the belief that no detail is too tiny to matter. Just as the meeting winds down, someone brings out a wax-sealed jar labeled King's Theatre, June 1867. Inside, pink fluff with a hint of gold thread. Supposedly collected from the folds of a duchess's opera gown. The jar is passed gently, hand to hand. No words. Just a quiet reverence. You realize you've been holding your breath. In the Victorian world of sweeping declarations and moral panic, the Lint Hunters Society stood for something beautifully pointless. And that, ironically, is what made it meaningful. As you step out into the foggy night, coat buttoned, you check your pockets. There it is. Lint. You smile. The next morning, or at least what passes for morning in fog-choked Victorian London, you find yourself wandering down a narrow cobblestone lane called Sutmere Row. It's the kind of place where every window has curtains that never move, and the air always smells faintly of damp coal and moral decay. At the end of the street stands a small brick building with blacked-out windows and a brass sign that reads, Institute for the Study of Modern Decay. You let yourself in. The hallway is lined with portraits, serious men in academic robes holding handkerchiefs aloft, as if they've just plucked something meaningful from their trouser pockets. One plaque reads, Professor Edmund Bilby, discoverer of urban thread conglomeration syndrome. He looks stern. Slightly itchy. This is where the story shifts. Because while most lint studies were quirky and curious, a darker strain ran through the Victorian obsession. The belief that lint and all forms of domestic debris was evidence of moral and societal collapse. Welcome to the age of visible decay. You're escorted into a seminar room by a clerk who offers you a boiled sweet and a pamphlet titled The Fluff Within: Symptoms of Civilizational Decline. The lecture begins before you can escape. A heavy-set man in a fraying waistcoat is at the front of the room gesturing wildly at a diagram showing the correlation between coal soot in household lint and spiritual lethargy. He speaks with the urgency of a man who's found doom hiding in a trouser crease. Victorian thinkers increasingly saw lint as symptomatic of something deeper, something unraveling. The Industrial Revolution had brought filth into homes, steam into lungs, and stress into previously idle drawing rooms. And lint, that omnipresent fuzz, was framed as the physical fallout of modern life itself. One speaker during a 1875 symposium famously declared, "Our fibers are fraying, our morals thinning. Look to your pockets, gentlemen, we are coming undone." It wasn't all theatrical doom, though. Some tried to quantify it. You're shown the lint-to-fabric ratio scale, a now-forgotten attempt to calculate how quickly different fabrics degraded under modern conditions. Cotton shirts had a short half-life, while good wool could apparently survive a spiritual crisis and a damp train ride. Historians still argue whether these theories were genuine scientific efforts or simply a way for grumpy scholars to yell at clouds in waistcoats. But it didn't stop there. You're introduced to the work of Dr. Emmett Swithers, who built a household debris map of London. He and his team collected samples from 372 homes, categorized their lint by fiber content, and created elaborate charts linking high lint environments to everything from marital tension to early baldness. Dr. Swithers published his findings in a thick tome titled Motes of Moral Rot, which he insisted be bound in unbleached linen to preserve textual integrity. The book includes terrifying tables, such as the infamous Debris Escalation Index, where lint was rated in shades of grey, light grey being normal dust accumulation, deep grey being urban despair, and black being probable vice. One of the researchers whispers to you that Swithers was later caught dusting other people's staircases in disguise, trying to gather unapproved samples. He was quietly retired. But his legacy remained, the idea that household fluff wasn't just a mess, it was a mirror. And for Victorians, mirrors were dangerous. You find yourself staring at a small glass case in the corner of the room. Inside is a velvet-lined tray with 5 tiny labeled piles. Bachelor's jacket, factory girl's shawl, clergyman's hat interior, sickroom bedding, orphan's sleeve cuff. Each tells a story. Each is evidence of wear, struggle, or neglect. The orphan's sleeve cuff is particularly heartbreaking, pale grey, with tiny blue threads. A tag notes, high static. Likely nervous fidgeting. It hits you harder than expected. And that's what this branch of lint science leaned into, emotional resonance tied to social fear. The Victorians had no TikTok, but boy did they know how to catastrophize a fluff ball. You're now seated across from a woman named Miss Lydia Featherstone, a public hygiene reformer with opinions as sharp as her collarbone. She's holding a small vial of lint and a list of symptoms. People used to laugh, she tells you, but I've seen it. The link between dust and decline. Mental collapse starts with a poorly swept hearth. You want to challenge that, but then she says something stranger. Some say lint absorbs trauma. You blink. She explains, slowly, as if you're not ready for it, that a few doctors began to believe lint behaved like a spiritual sponge. It clung to the residue of suffering. Rooms where people wept or argued or died produced denser, darker, sadder lint. A theory so fringe it never made the journals, but one she swears by. She opens her bag and hands you a black glass jar. Inside, a tight, matted clump of grey-blue fibers. Sickroom, 1878, she says softly. Influenza. For lost. All in this bed. You don't speak for a moment. The air feels heavier. As if grief itself lingers in the fluff. Victorians didn't have the tools to measure mental health as we do today. They had no vocabulary for burnout, for trauma, for the slow erosion of spirit under daily pressure. So they looked for signs in the body, in the air, and in the debris we leave behind. And somehow, Lint offered them something to hold. Something to analyze. To blame. To name. You walk out of the institute quieter than you entered. There's a man sweeping the steps outside. As he lifts the broom, a small spiral of lint flutters away on the breeze, grey, nearly invisible. You watch it float. And wonder what it remembers. The rain has started. A soft drizzle taps against the windows as you enter the sitting room of a townhouse that smells of rosewater and starch. The floorboards creak beneath you in that perfect Victorian way, as if the house is politely acknowledging your presence. A maid takes your coat, and then you're left in the company of 4 women gathered around a round table, each with a silk-bound journal in her lap and a jar of lint in front of her. "Welcome," one of them says with a measured smile. "We're the ladies' fluff circle." You stifle a laugh. They do not. Here's the thing. While men of the era formed serious lint societies and wore monocles while naming fibers, Victorian women had their own parallel world of fluff, a world just as meticulous, far more poetic, and infinitely more passive-aggressive. On the surface, it all looked like harmless homemaking. But beneath that polished etiquette, these women were building a quiet empire of domestic data. You're handed a dainty pamphlet titled The Genteel Collector, a woman's guide to observing household particles. It's pale blue with a little drawing of a hand holding tweezers. The chapters are surprising. Choosing your first jar. Lint extraction with modesty. Fiber as moral reflection. What your husband's cuff reveals about his mood. You leaf through. It's oddly sincere, peppered with lines like fluff need not be filthy, nor disgraceful, it is memory-rendered thread. And you realize, this wasn't a joke to them. It was a practice. A ritual. Maybe even a little bit of rebellion. Each woman at the table shares her current sample. One has pulled a soft mass from beneath her youngest child's cradle. Another has harvested the fine dust lining the stairs. The eldest proudly displays a jar labeled husband's chair, post-argument. You ask what they do with the jars. Interpretation, says one, her voice soft but firm. We document patterns, emotions, shifts in mood. A woman who notices lint, notices everything. This is how domestic science became less about science and more about silent resistance. Victorian women were expected to manage their homes without complaint, to be graceful, diligent, observant, but not necessarily heard. Lint gave them a new language, one they could whisper about behind teacups, tucked between sewing sessions and child-rearing and trying not to scream into a bread pudding. One woman named Beatrice opens a velvet-lined box. Inside are 20 tiny corked vials arranged in a perfect arc. Each is tagged with a single word: hope, jealousy, boredom, resentment, bliss. From the bedsheets, she explains. After important nights, you swallow hard. It suddenly feels very personal in here. Historians still argue whether these emotional tags were meant to be scientific or symbolic. Some scholars suggest the jars were more akin to diaries, records of feeling, trapped in dust. Others argue the women genuinely believed that fluff held emotional residue, like scent or body heat. Honestly, you're not sure which answer feels stranger. Either way, you're now staring at a practice that was half housekeeping, half emotional archaeology. These women weren't just collecting lint. They were curating absence. What was left behind after everything else was tidied away. The youngest woman, Anna, shows you her lint log. It's handwritten, organized by week, and beautifully illustrated in the margins with little ink flourishes. One entry reads, April 12th, Lavender-scented lint found beneath piano bench. Possible sign of secret rendezvous. Martha denies everything. Investigation continues. You ask if she ever confronted Martha. She just smiles. One doesn't need to confront when one has evidence. You're beginning to suspect Victorian women invented passive-aggressive surveillance long before the invention of passive-aggressive post-it notes. At one point, someone brings out a tea tray with shortbread and a cloth-wrapped package. Inside are lint portraits, tiny faces sketched in charcoal and filled in with tinted fibers. One, clearly modeled after a husband, has a slight sneer. Another shows a woman holding a parasol, surrounded by swirling threads. That's grief, they say. Postpartum, 1879. The room falls quiet. One woman, Eleanor, takes your hand and leads you to a cabinet. Would you like to see the confessional jars? She asks, as if inviting you into a secret. You nod. Inside the cabinet, glass containers arranged in a semicircle, each with layers of lint pressed like sediment in a rock. Each layer is labeled by date and event. August 4th, 1872, disappointment in church pew. October 13th, 1873, realized he loved someone else. March 2nd, 1875, forgave him anyway. There's no judgment. Just documentation. You don't realize you've gone still until Eleanor gently shuts the door. We all collect what we can't say, she murmurs. There's humor, too. One jar reads Mother-in-law's visit, and it's stuffed with what looks suspiciously like shredded lace and passive rage. Another simply says, the Thursday that would not end. You sit back down, feeling the weight of it all, not in a heavy way, but in a textured, threadbare kind of melancholy. These women had found a way to speak without speaking. To say, I was here. I felt this. Even if no one asked. One last thing catches your eye, a slim red book titled Lint as Warning, a lady's early detection guide. Apparently, some women believed certain lint formations foretold arguments, illnesses, or social embarrassment. One chart shows a cluster of tangled white fibers labeled impending visit from an overbearing aunt. You want to laugh, but then you remember how often your own stress shows up in clutter, in crumbs, in that little pile of who knows what on your nightstand. Maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe it all does mean something. You leave the house with a borrowed handkerchief and a borrowed jar. Your sample? A tiny wisp of pink thread from the edge of a couch cushion. It's been deemed quietly concerned. You tuck it into your pocket. You step outside into a brighter street than the ones before, one with gas lamps still flickering from the night and bakery smells curling around corners. But your destination now is not a salon or a sitting room. It's a building whose tall iron gate reads, the Polytechnic for Textile Pathologies. You weren't expecting academia to get involved in this, were you? Inside, a narrow hallway opens to a vaulted gallery with rows of glass cabinets, humming gaslights, and an aroma that's equal parts starch, soap, and something faintly scorched. A woman in a long navy coat, Professor Hyacinth Beadle, greets you briskly and adjusts her spectacles with the practiced speed of someone used to lint emergencies. You're late for the tour, she says, tapping her walking stick once on the stone floor. Let's begin. The gallery is extraordinary. Row after row of tiny exhibits, each displaying what Professor Beadle calls cases. One has a small clump of pale blue fuzz surrounded by magnified drawings. Shirt cuff disintegration syndrome, she says. Common among clerks and bank tellers. Sign of repetitive movement and increasing social despair. You blink, and she's already moved on. This a classic. Thread bloom. Found in women's gloves after extended periods of polite anxiety. Notice the rounded ends and speckling, classic sign of suppressed opinions. So yes, you're in the deep end now. Welcome to the Victorian movement to medicalize lint. It was only a matter of time. With industrialization came new illnesses, literal ones, like lung damage from smog, and invented ones, like railway spine, telegraphist's wrist, and now, apparently, domestic fluff accumulation disorder. Historians still argue whether any of these conditions were real, psychosomatic, or just rebranded misery. But Victorians were hooked on naming things. If lint existed, and it did, with vigor, then surely, it could hurt you. Professor Beadle leads you into the pathology room. The ceiling arches high and echoey. There are rows of pinned samples under glass, like butterflies, except these butterflies are thread clumps, hair twists, and the occasional rogue button. Observe, she says, gesturing to one particularly dense example. Stage 4 sofa lint. Neglected for approximately 6 months. Saturated with melancholy and sandwich crumbs. You find a plaque titled The Great Lint Plague of 1871. Turns out, a series of London boarding houses reported unusually aggressive accumulations of sofa lint in a single month. Some panicked. Newspapers ran headlines like Fluff Storm heralds impending moral collapse. One woman reportedly fainted upon discovering a dust ball with 3 distinct hair types embedded within it. Scandalous. A local doctor named Harwood Pewham declared the phenomenon to be a symptom of environmental inertia, his way of saying people were sitting down too much, thinking dark thoughts, and not sweeping enough. He prescribed exercise and vinegar foot baths. No one knows if it helped. You're shown a chart linking lint density to mood swings. It's very colorful and wildly speculative. One graph claims that if lint particles cluster in triangular formations, it may suggest unresolved longing or mild toothache. Another shows a pattern described as the spiral of midlife doubt. You laugh. Professor Beadle does not. And then, something unexpected. In a side room lit only by sunlight streaming through a dusty skylight, you find the forensic lint analysis desk. This, says Beadle, is where the serious work happens. Apparently, lint had a short-lived career in Victorian criminal forensics. In a few sensational trials, lint was used as supporting evidence to determine presence at a scene. In one infamous case, a constable presented a jar of lint taken from a suspect's trousers and matched it to fibers found on the victim's couch. The courtroom gasped. The suspect wept. It was described in the London Illustrated as a triumph of modern fluffcraft. Of course, modern scholars question whether any of it was remotely scientific. But the idea stuck. You're shown lint that was reportedly gathered from a glove left behind during a botched burglary. The jar is labeled thread cluster number 16B, possible guilt. It's mostly grey wool with a suspicious speck of red silk. Possibly a ribbon. Possibly blood. Possibly jam. In another case, a maid accused of theft was exonerated when her apron lint failed to match the velvet of the drawing room curtains. The sample is here, sealed under wax, next to a note that reads, "Justice via fluff." There's even a modest exhibit of what Professor Beadle calls spontaneous lint combustions. In truth, these were likely just unfortunate fires caused by open flames and dry fabric. But some believed neglected lint harbored bad energy, emotional tension so potent it could erupt. One pamphlet from 1878 warns, "Do not let the sorrow of the house settle too deeply in the sofa. It may rise." You shiver. By now, you're no longer laughing at any of this. The medicalized lint theories may have been questionable, the graphs may have been hand-drawn nonsense, but beneath all that, you can sense the deeper fear, that modern life was unraveling, fiber by fiber, and no one really knew how to stitch it back together. As you're leaving, Professor Beadle presses a small parcel into your hand. "A lint diagnostic kit," she says. "If you ever feel untethered." Inside, tweezers, a black velvet square, a journal with pre-printed columns, and a sealed jar labeled "Your Turn." You step back out onto the street. The sky is clearing. Sunlight breaks through, catching on tiny threads clinging to your coat. You pull one free and wonder what it says about you. You're in a train now. A proper Victorian compartment, plush red velvet seats, mahogany paneling, a lace antimacassar under your head, and outside, the English countryside scrolls by in a blur of green hedgerows and rain-soaked fields. But inside this small, wood-paneled box, you're not alone. Across from you sits a man with perfectly parted hair, shoes polished to the edge of absurdity, and a brown suitcase with the initials JTW. He smiles faintly. "Jonathan T. Wickles," he says, extending a gloved hand. "Field collector for the traveling Lint registry. You weren't aware that was a thing." "Oh yes," he says with a quiet pride. "We document Lint, in motion." You blink. He continues. "You see, stationary samples only tell half the story. True Lint lives in motion, on trains, in carriages, on the hems of coats walking through coal-dusted alleys. Mobile fibers. Migratory fluff. That's the frontier. You sip your tea." He opens his case. Inside, a tray of velvet-lined compartments, each one holding a sealed envelope or small jar, tagged with location, date, time, and emotional conditions. One is labeled 3:42 p.m. a Birmingham platform, hopeful, slightly damp. You're holding the forgotten footprints of moving people. This is the golden age of mobile lint studies, an obscure but strangely poetic chapter of Victorian science, when researchers like Wickles rode trains, omnibuses, and even the occasional canal barge, armed with pocket journals and tweezers, seeking what they called transit traces. They believed that people shed emotional residue not only in rooms but in transit, especially when they were in between things. Between cities. Between decisions. Between lives. Historians still argue whether the movement itself changed the composition of lint. Some insisted that motion induced stress fibers, those tiny warped strands that twisted more tightly in emotional flux. Others believed the shaking of trains randomized lint in a way that made it more honest. You peer through the window as the countryside flickers by, and you begin to wonder. What have you left behind in taxis, on airplanes, in the back seats of rideshares? Is your DNA scattered across upholstery in fragments of old sweaters and anxious commutes? Mr. Wickles is now sorting through a fresh collection. "Last week, I rode from Liverpool to Bath," he says, pulling out a jar marked second class, rainstorm. Inside, grey-blue threads, a speck of leaf, and what looks suspiciously like a cake crumb. 3 widows. 1 elopement. You can smell the tension. He hands you a booklet, the Travelling Debris Gazette, Autumn Edition. There's a section titled Top 10 Lintiest Routes, which includes 1. London to Brighton, high romance, moderate lint. 2. Glasgow to York, quiet despair, wool heavy. 3. Bath to Dover, adventurous flannel, crumbs increasing. Yes, this is real. Yes, they took it very seriously. You learn that some trains began installing sample cushions, small velvet rectangles near armrests designed to passively collect lint for anonymous study. Conductors were instructed to leave them undisturbed. There's even record of a lint library car briefly tested on a northern route, offering passengers the opportunity to examine famous samples mid-journey. Wickles recounts the time he rode the overnight train to Aberdeen seated beside a retired actor in full costume. "A velvet cape," he whispers, "and so much lint it sang." You chuckle, but inside, something stirs. You realize that this lint fixation, so silly at times, was also a kind of intimacy. The idea that you could understand a stranger by the fibers they leave behind. Their haste. Their habits. Their moods. Like reading tea leaves, only fluffier. At one point, Wickles grows solemn. "I once found a cluster of red threads in a train car," he says quietly. "Bright crimson. Silk. In an envelope tucked under the seat. It was labeled for her. if she ever returns. He stares out the window for a moment. You say nothing. Later, as the train slows and pulls into a station, you pass through a narrow corridor lined with advertisement posters. One catches your eye. Feeling lost? Visit the Museum of Vanished Travelers, where every thread tells a journey. You smile. Of course there's a museum. Mr. Wickles stands, brushing a fleck of lint from his coat. This is my stop, he says. But remember, movement leaves memory. Pay attention. He's gone before you can ask what happens to all the samples. But you suspect you already know. Back in your seat, you find a jar on the windowsill, left behind. It's labeled only, carriage number 4, heavy sky, resigned laughter. You tuck it into your bag. Later that same afternoon, you're standing before a weathered brick building with a crooked sign that reads, "The Museum of Vanished Travelers," just like the poster promised. A bell tinkles as you step inside, and suddenly, the air changes. It's hushed here. Not the silence of libraries, but something gentler, as if everyone inside is holding their breath, not from awe, but from a kind of mutual longing. A woman in a grey smock greets you without fanfare. "First time?" she asks. You nod. "Take your time," she says. "The exhibits, remember." You're not sure what that means yet. The entrance hall is dim, with only soft, golden light filtering down from a high stained glass dome. Dust motes drift lazily in the beams, as though even they're reluctant to land. The floors creak beneath your steps, but they're muffled by thick carpet, threadbare in places, as if worn down by 1,000 careful feet. The first room is titled, Unclaimed Journeys. Inside, glass cases house items collected from train cars, ship cabins, and travel lodges, items left behind with no names, no notes, no follow-up. Each one sits beside a small card that details not who owned it, but where it was found, and what lint was recovered nearby. One case contains a cracked leather glove, a tiny grey fluff nestled inside. The card reads, "Found in a railway sleeper from Dover to Edinburgh, 1872. Lint sample, wool blend, ash-scented, with traces of lavender. Believed to belong to a woman who wept quietly for 53 minutes before disembarking without a word." You step back. The next case holds a child's toy horse stuffed with rough cloth, tail missing. The lint nearby contains bright red thread, cottonseed fragments, and a single golden eyelash. Last seen aboard the SS Melrose. Cabin 42. Never claimed. You feel it, suddenly, the ache of not knowing. The trail left behind by people who moved through the world and then disappeared, leaving only particles behind. And yet, it's comforting, somehow. Proof that they existed. Historians still argue whether the museum was created for remembrance or merely oddity. Founded in 1881 by a woman named Elsabet Truss, herself a former railway clerk turned anthropological eccentric, it began as a private archive of objects and fluff, growing slowly as she sent letters to train stations and hotel managers asking, "Have you found anything unfinishable?" They sent her lint. And stories. One room is simply titled Whispers. You walk through narrow aisles, where headphones hang on velvet cords beside displays. When you listen, you hear reenacted journal entries, read in hushed voices, describing lint discoveries and the imagined lives of those who left them behind. A blue thread curled beside a teacup. She drank in haste. I think she was scared. The hem lint from his overcoat had gunpowder traces. I think he meant to leave for good. Grey cotton, wrapped in gold foil. Wedding night nerves. You pause, overwhelmed by the intimacy of it all. The smallest details, recorded with the gravity of great epics. Further on, in a room lined with shadowy portraits, you find the archive of misidentified owners. These are the people they thought the lint belonged to, guesses made from notes, passenger logs, even scuff marks on boots. Each portrait hangs with a jar of sample lint beneath it. Some jars are empty now, faded by time. Some are full, dense with layered fibers. One tag reads, "Believed to be Mr. Cecil Hawthorne, last seen in Calais." Lint suggests anxiety, damp coat, and a recent cinnamon bun. It's strangely comforting that someone tried. But the strangest room of all is the final one, the lint loop. It's a circular gallery with mirrored walls and a single revolving platform at the center, where a slow, continuous display of spinning lint jars rotate beneath spotlights. Some are exquisite fibers arranged by color, like Victorian snow globes. Others are simple, crumpled wool and cotton caught mid-flutter. Above you, words are etched into the curve of the ceiling. All that we leave lingers. You stand there longer than you mean to, watching the jars go by, like ghosts on parade. Each one a fragment, a memory, a message in a bottle made of fuzz. You recall something Mr. Wickles said, "Movement leaves memory." But here, even stillness remembers. Before you leave, you notice a guest book near the door. A line of entries, handwritten in every kind of script, each one simpler than the last. "For my father, who never came home. She sat here. I know it. I forgive you." You sign your name, then hesitate. And under it, you write, "Still unraveling. Still here." When you walk back into the street, the world feels louder, faster. But you carry the quiet of the museum with you, tucked inside like a folded scrap of threadbare cloth. In your pocket, a single thread sticks to your coat lining. You leave it there. The next morning, you find yourself at a small park in Hampstead. The grass is damp. The hedges have been clipped into tidy obedience. There's a wooden bench near the path with an iron plaque that reads simply, "Lint bench, for observational use only." You sit. Within seconds, you notice it, the subtle fuzz collecting in the creases between slats. Mostly grey. A few stray red threads. One suspiciously mint-green speck that might be a remnant of chewing gum's more innocent cousin. A gentleman approaches from the far end of the path. He wears a perfectly brushed coat and a hat set at the precise angle of someone who takes both symmetry and lint very seriously. He stops a few paces away, gives a polite nod, and says, "I see you found the bench. Mind if I join you?" You shrug. He sits. "I'm with the London Outdoor Lint Watchers Guild," he says, pulling a small leather notebook from his pocket. "We specialize in public fuzz." You glance at the bench again. So this is real. Of course it is. The guild was formed in 1879 by civic-minded Victorians convinced that public lint reflected the psychological health of a city. If household lint revealed private struggle, public lint told the story of collective anxiety. The guild mapped benches, alleyways, bus stops, once buses got bumpy enough, and even certain statue bases for lint accumulation. They published quarterly reports, delivered lectures, and in one bizarre case, held a funeral for an unusually large dust cluster found near Piccadilly Circus. You lean back and listen. The gentleman, Mr. Giles, he finally offers, flips through his notes. Last week, the Westminster bus shelter yielded a 3.4-gram sample of wool cotton polyester composite. Mostly navy. Suspected businessman. Rainwear. Mood. Irritated but resigned. He pauses. Possibly a tax auditor. You try not to laugh, but the image is perfect. As he speaks, you begin to notice more. A worn coat sleeve brushing the armrest. A pigeon hopping near a drain with a thread in its beak. A teenager walking by, headphones in, oblivious, but shedding fibers all the same. That's the secret of public lint, it's democratic. Unlike the curated jars of aristocrats and obsessive collectors, this is the raw, unfiltered fluff of daily life. The kind of debris we leave behind when we think no one's looking. One of the guild's earliest manifestos, Mr. Giles explains, stated, "A society's lint is a mirror of its motion, its anxieties, and its absent-minded affection." It was published anonymously in a pamphlet left on tram seats across the city. To this day, no one knows who wrote it. Historians still argue whether the Guild was more performance art than science. But then again, can't it be both? Mr. Giles shows you his field kit, a velvet pouch containing tweezers, a bristle brush, a magnifying monocle, and 3 vials, each labeled ambient mood, unexpected romance, mild commuter crisis. He insists that certain locations generate more emotionally charged lint. You want heartbreak? Try the bench outside Paddington Station. Elation? The edge of Regent's Park during a festival. Existential dread? Tottenham Court Road on a Sunday. You start to believe him. He gestures across the park to a narrow, tree-shaded path. See that grove? That's where we found the Whisper Cluster. Mid-June, 1883. A tangled knot of silver-grey wool with traces of rose perfume and what we believe was songbook paper dust. Some said it was just a dropped scarf. Others, something more. You ask how they catalogue all this. Carefully, he says. And with a sense of humor. Without it, this would all be madness. With it, it's art. He pulls from his pocket a folded map, an actual fluff atlas of London, each square marked with color-coded pins, low lint activity, moderate fluff presence, lint crisis zones. The East End is practically glowing. One corner of the map is labeled the Ghost Line, a stretch of pavement where lint reportedly vanishes overnight, no matter the accumulation. No explanation. No evidence. Just nothing. Mr. Giles taps that part of the map. We don't know why, he says, quietly. But it feels important. You sit in silence for a while, watching the sun drift behind the trees. A gust of wind kicks up a swirl of dry leaves, and with them, the tiniest tumble of lint, catching the light like fragile comets. You both watch until it disappears. You ever collect for yourself? You ask. He hesitates, then pulls from his coat a single, slender jar. Inside, barely enough to see. A pale lavender strand, a fleck of paper, and a fine silver hair. The label reads, Her, Waiting. March 14th. You say nothing. Just nod. Sometimes, the smallest things carry the most weight. As the afternoon light begins to fade, Mr. Giles stands. Well, I've another bench to observe. He tips his hat. If you ever find something unusual, bring it to the Guild. You watch him disappear into the haze. Alone again, you run your hand over the bench slats. You gather a tiny puff of lint in your palm. It's nothing, really, just grey fluff. But to someone, somewhere, it might mean everything. You let it drift away on the breeze. Now it's evening. The kind of early Victorian dusk that arrives like a velvet curtain, pulled quietly across the city sky. Gas lamps flicker to life with a faint hiss, and chimney smoke curls lazily in the cooling air. You're no longer in the parks or stations, you've followed the trail of lint further still, to the very edges of the ordinary. You find yourself in a cramped attic above a bookbinder's shop in Clerkenwell. It smells of leather, glue, and something older. Something dusty in a way even dust can't explain. A man in fingerless gloves and a dented bowler hat greets you. Evening. Welcome to the archive of forgotten threads. He says it like you've heard of it. You haven't. But soon you realize, this is no public museum. No neat glass cases or brass plaques. This is a labyrinth of shelves, every inch covered in jars, boxes, folded fabric, and handwritten ledgers. Nothing matches. Everything matters. You're handed a pair of cotton gloves. You'll need these. The lint here is sensitive. He leads you down a narrow aisle lined with wooden drawers, each labeled in strange shorthand CRY12, SMU3X, Lacedent. You open one. Inside, an envelope of pale green fuzz and a note. From a glove dropped outside a hospital window, 1862. Accompanied by faint weeping. This is something deeper. Not about science. Not even about symbolism. This is about memory, the fragments that slip through cracks, stuck forever to the fabric of things. It's messy, grieving, and sometimes beautiful. The man, who introduces himself only as Tibbs, explains that this attic is unofficial, off-registry, and entirely voluntary. No government grants. No university connections. Just people who care enough to send what shouldn't be thrown away. You ask, why lint? He shrugs. Because you can lie with words, but fibers don't bother. They just stay. The archive was started in 1867 by a widow named Maud Ellings. She had a habit of sweeping corners others ignored, beneath pews, behind wardrobes, under sickbeds, and writing down what she found. At first, it was grief. But then it became more. She once described lint as the dust of untold truths. Historians still argue whether Ellings was grieving or revolutionizing soft history. But most agree, she was doing both. You open a jar marked Euston, Terminal 9, Final Goodbye. Inside, the smallest fragment of lace, singed at one edge. There's a faint smell of perfume. A note tucked inside reads, "He never came back." But this did. You're not sure how long you spend in the archive. Hours. Time moves slowly here, padded by velvet and the soft hush of falling threads. Tibbs shows you the matchbook wall, a part of the attic dedicated to reunions. These are cases where someone found a bit of lint, a thread, a scrap, and then, years later, discovered where it came from. A pink fuzz reunited with the hem of a christening gown. A tobacco-scented clump returned to the son of a missing sailor. Even a single dog hair, tucked into a locket, identified by a woman who whispered, "That's my Chester." I'd know his shedding anywhere. Each match is recorded in a ledger with trembling penmanship. Page after page of human connection via fluff. One entry reads, April 3rd, found blue wool, stitched to memory of coat. Girl recognized it instantly. Wept. Left a flower. You don't ask for details. Some things are better felt than explained. Later, in a back room, you find something stranger still, the lint cabinet of possible futures. It's absurd. Speculative lint. Fibers labeled not by past but by what might have been. What she would have worn to the wedding. The scarf he never bought. The threads of an apology never made. Each sample is accompanied by imagined notes, poetic, wistful, eerily specific. One card reads, "Threads from the coat she didn't wear on the night she stayed home and lived." You look to Tibbs, puzzled. He smiles. Sometimes, you have to document the ghosts that never happened. You close the cabinet gently. There's a final drawer you're allowed to open. It contains what they call the lost and willing samples people have given to the archive. On purpose. As offerings. Each one tagged with messages. I no longer need this memory. Let someone else carry it. May this thread hold what I couldn't. For anyone who's ever missed the last train, you feel a sting behind your eyes. Because the lint here isn't just fluff, it's what's left behind when love is too heavy to carry, or when joy passes through a room too quickly to grab. It's every unsaid goodbye, every unread letter, every Sunday morning ache. And here, none of it is thrown away. As you prepare to leave, Tibbs hands you a card with nothing on it but 3 words. Collect with care. He doesn't follow you to the door. Outside, the city seems louder. The street lamps buzz. The wind tugs at your coat. You find yourself checking the corner of your sleeve. One thread's come loose. You decide to let it go. You wake the next morning with your head full of threads. Your dreams had been soft, cottony things, quiet corridors, spinning jars, whispers carried on the lint-lined breeze. You blink against the pale light filtering through the curtains and stretch beneath heavy wool blankets, suddenly very aware of the fine, grey dust tucked into the corners of your sheets. You brush a bit of fuzz from your collar and smile. Today, you're going underground. Beneath the polished streets of Victorian London lies a lesser-known world, not just of saws and steam tunnels, but of basement societies, hidden clubs that met below haberdasheries, tailors, and laundries. And among the strangest of them was this, the Order of the Threadbare Circle. Your invitation came scrawled on the back of a laundry tag. Thursday, 11 p.m. Behind Beasley's buttons. Ask for the third hinge. And so here you are, ducking through a wooden service entrance, climbing down an uneven stone stair, and stepping into a candlelit room that smells faintly of starch, tobacco, and something ancient. A hush falls as you enter. 12 people in threadbare suits and cloaks sit around a circular table, each with a hood pulled low, each with a single jar of lint before them. You expected theatrical nonsense. Instead, you get reverence. No one speaks at first. A brass bell chimes. The person at the head of the circle rises. He introduces himself as Brother Pilling. Tonight, he says, we honor the silent fabric. That which has been worn, abandoned, and borne witness. Turns out, the threadbare circle isn't about science or sentiment. It's about ritual. They believe that lint is the final distillation of life, not death, exactly, but what remains after motion ceases. Like ash from a fire or crumbs from a feast. And for them, this humble fluff is a symbol of everything we use up and never thank. You sit in silence as each member presents their sample of the month. A fragment of wool from a war widow's shawl, swept from the floor just after she passed. A speck of velvet from a burned opera house seat, its patron never identified. A curl of navy twill found in a prison cot, dated 1869, with regret written beneath in Latin. Each one is placed reverently in the center of the table. Not to be studied. Not to be explained. Just to be. One member, a woman with ink-stained fingers, leans toward you. It's not about the lint, she whispers. It's about what it witnessed. You ask how the circle began. She smiles faintly. During the great coat shortage of 1854. Too many bodies, not enough fabric. People started passing garments down. And down. And down. Lint was the only thing that stayed. So this wasn't a club. It was a memorial. Historians still argue whether the Order of the Threadbare Circle was real, or simply an urban legend cobbled together from laundry ledgers and ghost stories. But a few dusty records suggest something close to truth. Mentions in parish logs, a faded registry of cloth confessors, and one anonymous letter describing the quiet worship of what phrase. One legend even claims they performed lint burials, burying glass jars beneath trees, or hiding them in chimney bricks, like time capsules of sorrow. Some jars were supposedly found during later renovations, containing notes like "I forgave her, finally, and he never got cold again." You ask about their rules. No washing, says Brother Pilling flatly. No bleach. No invention. Only discovery. He pauses. And always carry a thread. A small string is handed to you, frayed, golden, wrapped 3 times around itself. For guidance, they say. Or unraveling. Tonight's ceremony concludes with the gentle loosing. Each member reaches into a velvet pouch and scatters a handful of gathered lint into a slow-turning copper basin of water. The basin spins gently, the fibers dancing just beneath the surface. It's strangely hypnotic. You watch one curl of red thread drift and sink like a forgotten sentence. Afterward, tea is served. It's simple, weak, warm, comforting. They speak softly. Not about loss. but about texture. One woman recalls how her grandmother's shawl always smelled of pine. Another describes the comforting scratch of her father's old coat on Sunday mornings. You realize, lint is never just the thing. It's the memory of the thing. They hand you a tiny brass key before you leave. No explanation. Just a nod. You'll know when. Back on the street, the city is different. Still bustling. Still chaotic. But somehow more fragile now. As if every jacket, every skirt hem, every carpet edge is quietly crumbling under the weight of being lived in. You notice a clump of dust in the gutter and pause. Maybe you don't pick it up. Maybe you just watch it flutter in the streetlight for a moment before the wind takes it. You walk on. And in your pocket, the golden thread warms against your palm. It's a grey morning, the kind where the sky forgets how to shine and everything feels faintly soaked. You've wandered west now, drawn by a half-whispered rumor shared over tea in the threadbare circle, a name mentioned only once, in reverent tones. The spindle. No one explained what it was. Just that it spun. Always. And that those who saw it never quite looked at lint the same again. The address you're given leads you to a quiet estate tucked behind an iron gate, ivy growing so thick across the facade it's almost swallowing the bricks whole. You expect a reclusive aristocrat. Instead, you find an inventor. Her name is Vera Cantwell. Late 60s, nimble fingers, hair like dandelion fluff and eyes that dart like she's always building something in her head. She meets you at the door with a faint smile and a lint roller tucked under one arm like a beloved pet. "You're here for the machine, then," she says. And without waiting for a reply, she turns and disappears inside. You follow her through what must once have been a ballroom, now transformed into a cathedral of gears, pulleys, and velvet-lined rails. At the center, beneath a hanging gas chandelier, the spindle. It's beautiful. 7 feet tall. Brass and walnut. Dozens of arms rotate in slow, mesmerizing spirals. Tiny brushes sweep delicately over threads suspended mid-air. Small bell jars pulse with captured lint, illuminated from within. The whole contraption hums softly, like a cat asleep on a radiator. Vera gestures for you to sit. "This," she says, "is the world's only emotional loom." You blink. Of course it is. She explains that the spindle doesn't weave cloth. It weaves memory. Not specific ones, nothing so precise, but emotional patterns, extracted from the lint of worn garments. Every sweater holds a mood, she says. This lets you feel it. She feeds in a threadbare scarf, one with lavender threads and 2 buttons clinging by a whisper. The machine begins to turn. You hear music, faint, tremulous, like a lullaby hummed through a cracked door. You feel warmth at your spine, like sitting in your mother's kitchen. You taste cinnamon. You don't remember any of it. But you feel it. The spindle, she tells you, was built in 1874 by her grandfather, one of the original fiber impressionists. The family secret wasn't fabric, it was the emotional conductivity of lint. While others catalogued fibers, Vera's family asked, "What if we could play them?" Historians still argue whether the spindle ever existed. Most believe it's a myth, a steampunk daydream. But here it is, whirring before you, breathing quiet nostalgia into the room. She runs another sample, a scrap of velvet from a theater seat. Suddenly, you're nervous. Like someone's about to speak your name over a loudspeaker. You feel the flutter of expectation, of lights dimming. Someone's hand is brushing yours, and then it's gone. The spindle stops. You exhale. Vera logs the emotional pattern in a notebook marked volume 92. There are dozens more on a nearby shelf. "We don't name the patterns," she says. "We just feel them." She lets you try one. From your coat pocket, you pull the lint you collected on the park bench. Grey, small. Almost nothing. She slides it into a brass intake valve. The machine spins. Slowly. You feel patience. The kind that aches behind the knees. A hint of tired laughter. The scent of old newspapers. Waiting, but not for something specific. Just waiting. You sit in silence. Vera smiles gently. That one's common, she says. Most people are made of it. You ask her if she ever used the spindle on her own clothes. She hesitates. Once, she says. A cuff from the coat I wore the day I left my husband. You raise your eyebrows. It played Rain on a piano, she says. And the smell of black tea gone cold. The spindle hums softly in the corner. Before you leave, Vera hands you a sealed jar. Inside, a swirl of navy wool, golden thread, and a single copper sequin. I call it possibility, she says. It's from a party no one attended. You don't know what to say, so you just nod. As you step back outside, the sky begins to brighten. Not much, just a gentle silvering along the edges of the clouds. You walk down the path with the jar in your pocket, thinking of all the fibers you've brushed past in your life. Every hug, every argument, every coat draped over someone's shoulders. And somewhere, in that humming ballroom behind you, the spindle continues to spin. Now the journey is winding down. You feel it like the last pages of a book turning more slowly, like the final embers of a fire burning soft and low. But there's one last place you need to visit. The place no one talks about directly. The one whispered about only in footnotes and late-night foot rubs at dusty libraries. You make your way north, through rows of Georgian townhouses and soot-smudged iron gates, to the edge of an old industrial quarter. There's a door painted entirely black, no sign, no knocker. You hesitate, then tap. It opens by itself. And inside waits a room of absolute stillness. A woman in a long charcoal dress gestures for you to enter. Her voice is barely above a breath. Welcome, she says, to the House of Final Fibers. The name says everything. This is the end of the line for Lint. The place where the Victorian obsession with fluff, thread, and stray fabric found its quietest, strangest sanctuary. The room is nearly empty. No shelves. No exhibits. Just a long table at the center, draped in ivory cloth. Upon it, a single wooden box. You sit across from the woman. She introduces herself as Edith Blee, caretaker of the house for 41 years. Her job? To decide when a piece of lint has told its story and when it's time for silence. This, she says, lifting the box's lid, is the retiring chest. Inside are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of tiny compartments, each no bigger than a thimble. Each holds a single, perfectly preserved cluster of lint. You lean in. A curl of black thread resting on a music sheet fragment. A speck of cotton wrapped around a broken cufflink. A faded red fiber shaped like a question mark. No labels. No notes. Just the knowledge that these pieces, once catalogued, displayed, studied, whispered about, have now earned their rest. Edith explains the house's role. Not as a museum. Not as a church. But as a lint hospice. When a jar has been handled too often, when its story has grown tired or distorted, it's brought here to be unthreaded gently from the world. There are ceremonies. Small, wordless rituals. Sometimes music. Often just breath. You ask her, who decides when it's time? No one, she says. The lint tells us. She places a small jar on the table. It's cloudy with age. Inside, beige fluff, a fleck of silver paper, and a single eyelash. This came from a post office floor, she says. They think it witnessed an unsent letter. You hold the jar. It's oddly warm. Or maybe that's your hand trembling. She nods. Would you like to give it peace? You say yes before you really understand what that means. Edith shows you how. You open the jar slowly, like cracking a secret. You tip the contents onto the cloth. The lint lands gently. Then, using a soft bristle brush, you coax it into a spiral, no science to it, just instinct. Then silence. Then breath. Then, she takes a brass stamp and presses it into the cloth beside the spiral. The mark it leaves behind is simple: infinity. And just like that, the story is closed. You place the lint into a thimble-sized compartment in the retiring chest. The box clicks shut. Historians still argue whether the house ever existed. Some believe it was a metaphor. Others think it was a private therapy practice gone delightfully off script. But the truth, like most things involving fluff, is softer and harder to pin down. You ask Edith if anyone ever retires their own lint. She smiles. All the time. From pockets. From pillowcases. From funeral coats. People bring it when they're ready to let go. Or when they need to remember how to. She hands you a folded cloth. In case you ever find something that's finished. It's embroidered with the symbol of the retiring chest. You realize that lint isn't just debris. It's what we carry long after we've stopped noticing. And eventually, it's what we release. You thank Edith and step out into the night. It's darker now. But not heavy. The kind of darkness that holds you instead of hiding you. You feel your coat shift as you walk. There's probably lint there too. But not all of it needs to be collected. Some of it can just be. The wind carries a hush tonight. You're back on your own street now, Victorian cobbles beneath your feet, familiar lampposts leaning in like old friends. And though the journey began with a strange question, why did Victorian scientists collect lint in jars, it no longer feels strange at all. It feels inevitable. You're not headed home just yet. Instead, you follow a quiet instinct to the alley behind your building. You've never really looked at it before. But now, under the golden halo of a gas lamp, you see the forgotten corners clearly. Lint clings to the drainpipe like a whispered apology. There's a tuft near a crate, damp, but still bright blue. And there, by the rusted gate, the soft nest of threads caught on a splintered fence post, shivering with every gust of air. You crouch without thinking. You examine the fibers. You feel the story in them, even if you don't know the words yet. Because now you understand. Every thread is the ending of something and the beginning of something else. A jacket worn through. A pillow finally left behind. A dancer's dress falling silent backstage. The lint that survives is what slips free in those fragile in-between moments. The kind we forget even as we live them. Tonight, you've decided to make your own collection. Not for science. Not for art. Just for memory. You step inside, climb the narrow staircase, and find an empty tea tin in the cupboard. You wipe it clean. Inside, you place the fluff from your pocket, the bit from the park bench, the one Giles nodded toward. You add a thread you just peeled from your cuff. And one lonely hair from a borrowed scarf you never returned. You label it, gently, today. Because that's enough. Victorian scientists tried to explain the world through lint, mapping it, analyzing it, even worshipping it. But the truth is simpler. They were trying to hold on to things. Moments. People. Feelings. Losses. Love. And somehow, the softest substance in the world was the only thing gentle enough to carry that weight. Historians still argue whether lint jars were folly or brilliance. But here you are, with one of your own. Not to prove anything. Just to remember. You tuck the tin away and climb into bed. Your sheets are warm. Somewhere, faintly, the hum of a fan begins to spin. The night presses close, but not unkindly. You wonder how much of yourself has already drifted into the world, left behind on a train, clinging to a pillow, folded into a jacket in a second-hand shop. And you smile. Because maybe, someday, someone else will find a thread of yours and just know that you were real. That you moved. That you mattered. That's enough. Now, just breathe. Let your chest rise slowly, and fall. The journey's behind you now. The jars, the whispers, the fragments of lives preserved in the quietest corners. You've walked through rain-damp alleyways and velvet-lined museums, sat beside people who measured the weight of memory in flecks and fibers. You've heard their stories, felt their losses, and maybe, just maybe, you've started to notice your own threads a little more tenderly. Let that thought drift. Let it float. The room around you softens. The walls stretch away. Your blanket settles over your body like the hush of moth wings. There is no more walking now. No more dusty attics or iron gates. Just stillness. And in that stillness, something remains. A curl of lint, barely visible. Your own little echo. It rests quietly, tucked in a drawer, or drifting in moonlight, or waiting in the folds of a coat you haven't worn in years. It doesn't need to be seen. It only needs to be remembered. So sleep now, thread by thread. No need to chase anything. No need to fix the unraveling. The world is full of pieces, and somehow, they're all connected. You're safe here. You're part of the fabric. And tonight, even your dreams wear soft velvet gloves. Let go. Let it all drift gently into the dark. Good night.